we had the pleasure of having Guido in our breakout room, and it was an interesting conversation. The observation that people want to belong, they want to uh, earn the esteem of their colleagues, they want to follow rules. So if the rules are crooked, but you follow the rules, you feel like you're doing the right thing. And then we thought, well, a good way to get around that is to have a choice. First of all, the important thing is to realize that you do have a choice, or most people do in most circumstances, and to recognize the choices that are available and to create the circumstances in your own life um, that allow you to have a choice that you can walk away or you can refuse. And then we were going to talk about how we can sort of span that to societal levels. How can we create rules in society, gender people to have more choices? Back into the main sessions.
I can say we went down many deep rabbit holes and could have gone on for a long time. And we're looking at a couple of things in terms of the roots of how does the structures of thinking from like the Enlightenment have, problematic structures to them and values or assumptions that are playing out now. And then another theme was how people actually avoid taking responsibility for their lives and situations, and not in the sense that they're to blame for it, but as I heard recently, you're the only one that can do something about your own life by choosing differently.
A similar discussion about, responsibility in the end, but we started out by reflecting, well, Audie reflected the work that he's doing with good leadership versus the dark patterns and what is the polarity between those two. Is one the bad thing and the other one is the antidote? And then the discussion was, what would it require to allow for the good to emerge? And what was his name? Gary spoke about the brain having a bias for negativity, so positivity not being caught. And then Otti was just finishing a thought when the when the breakout ended. So I don't know exactly what the finishing thought was, but it was that difficulty of perspective, what is good and what is bad, and how can we know, and how does context and circumstance determine a judgment on that or a feeling for that.
In my mind, I was kind of thinking you're covering a bunch of axes that I would expect in any sort of developmental hypothesis of social systems, right? So there's values and language, and you use the word language games a few times. There's institutions and practices, and there's individuals, their agency and leadership. And I think the slippery slope, so creating habits that go into that direction. I mean, to a degree, we were caught into a conversation to say, actually, what is bad, what is good? And I think that is something which most leaders are not trained in anymore, which adds possibly to your point on this separation theory, right? That business has its own rule and does not need to be moral. I mean, coming out of the work that you did, I would ask you, if you were the CEO of a company that is on the slippery slope, right? What is the most important interventions, or do you need to look at least at a number of these different patterns to ensure that it reverts to becoming good? Or is that even possible? I think that's probably a question I would ask.
Shall I engage in the conversation, Tom, or
Sure, yeah, go for
what's
it.
the next step? Okay. Well, when I do when I do workshops with companies, I normally focus on the patterns 2 to 9 and not on the ideology, for a simple reason. If you tell managers the main driver of the whole problem is ideology, they will sit back and think, okay, good, I can do nothing about that. That's from outside, it's bigger than me. So talk to someone else about it, right? But I can tell them, you don't have to be an asshole to be successful. You don't have to treat your people like shit to be successful. You don't have to give them goals they cannot achieve to have performance in the company. You don't need to engage in Hunger Games, because a lot of managers believe this is how it has to be. They went through the same things maybe themselves in their career, and I think, yeah, this is how you create performance, by being rough, by yelling, by pushing, and by stretching the goals more and more and more. They have to understand that this is not how you create performance. And you, Otti, together with Antoinette, you have worked a lot on developing alternative ideas about how to organize. And the HR theories to which you often refer show that this is not the best way to create performance. But this is what they believe. And business schools are part of this. I mean, we need to do some soul searching on that. I mean, what kind of role models do we give students? We tell them, you should be the next Steve Jobs, you should be the next Elon Musk, you should be the next Mark Zuckerberg. And these people are all sick to their bones. They're mentally ill. And we celebrate them for being ruthless and treating people like commodities and breaking the law. And we say, well, this is innovation. You have to smash it, and then you build. We have to give other signals to people who become managers to train them to be successful without destroying people. Because this is what you normally in scandals don't see. Scandals is, you see the surface, you see the airplanes that crash, the software that is manipulated, the blood testing machine that doesn't work, but what you don't see is crushed humans, losing their dignity, being humiliated, or being ashamed of their collusion and their silence. And so all that is not visible. And that is, I hope, what our book makes a bit more visible, that this disrespect for human beings, that has to stop.
Yeah, that's a nice intro into this. You know, as I struggle, I put in the chat this little matrix that I just use to try to work through my own processing of Guido's content, because you have these little things like this disrespect and the poisonous discourse we sometimes see even in social media and the circles that many of us are contributing to or are part of in our networks, where behavior's bad and disrespectful and not necessarily generative, and we may not like it, but we kind of write it off. But it's the roots of much more insidious or much more obvious problems or much more consequential problems. And while we can't necessarily change the ideology of Facebook, we can notice and respond to the bad behavior in social media, for example, or in our colleagues who are faking their enrollment and their MasterCards, right? So it's this 2x2 matrix of what is it that we can notice that's maybe actionable in our small space, that versus when it becomes obvious to everybody, and what is it that we have some agency around versus no control over whatsoever. So how do we dance through those different quadrants? It doesn't give you, it suggests a few answers on some different strategies that you can do there. But its biggest contribution, I think, is only to say that all these contexts exist for us. And when I listen to Guido, I love what he's saying, but I tend to get lost in that context of this big problem that I can do nothing of, and forget the fact that I'm in some way related to setting up those conditions or changing those conditions.
No, as I told you before, I think this is a very useful matrix to show types of reactions you can display when you are in these situations, and when they start small, you might be able to stop them if you would do the right thing, the right intervention early on, right?
Yeah.
And the main thing that starts early, and you mentioned these early examples, is these small transgressions that seem so harmless. I was recently working with a company that had a big corruption scandal, and they told me, well, the instigator of the corruption scheme, he was smoking in the office, and smoking was not allowed in the office. So he was breaking a rule that maybe people would consider where it's banal, it's benign, it's not the problem. It's just smoking. But it signals the willingness of someone to ignore rules. And that is a warning signal, an early warning signal that should lead to an intervention. And if a superior condones and tolerates that behavior, they go the next step, right? So to deal with this early on is super important. And it's easier to stop it early than later, normally.
How do you distinguish that in a more complex context? I mean, somebody smoking in a non-smoking area, yeah. I mean, every doorknob can recognize that, right? Looking across the Atlantic Ocean to the left, it becomes a little more difficult to gauge whether people are smoking in the office or not, right? And how do you determine that? So that question of perspective also there comes back, even or particularly when we think about what was discussed in the breakouts, what's working for whom. So who is being successful or able to keep processing despite or given circumstance. I mean, I feel that's what we're seeing on a geopolitical level at the moment, where the environment gets more fragile or more frail, or the pressure increases, and people start to become more willing to compromise on what is acceptable or not, or it was even engineered. I like the protagonist's dilemma and the ideas that you sent, Tom. I think they are a great guidance to, how can you take action? How can everybody start to do something? But it is a little more difficult to gauge in slightly more complex contexts because people see it differently if they have made different experience.
Well, it's certainly another level of complexity if you talk about the political system as such and as it slowly goes down the drain. But organizations start very often from a good point. They're good organizations. Boeing was a great engineering company. Volkswagen was having a decent culture until something started to happen. And this starting to happen is maybe where, if you are a conscious manager, conscious about these things, is where you should stop it, right? Superior should not allow the smoking in the office. And that is a very clear signal to everyone that even small transgressions are not allowed. If you don't follow the rules, it is not tolerated. Because the worst thing that you can create is a culture in which people think, as long as I'm successful, I can break rules. That's the worst thing you can create. Because necessarily over time, this rule breaking becomes bigger. Would a company fire its best salesperson if that person would engage in doubtful practices? Normally they wouldn't, right? Because it's the best salesperson. But that is a sign, it's a signal to the others. As long as you're successful, you can do these things. So therefore, I think the small rule breaking is something problematic that needs to be stopped early on. And then you might avoid the big rule breaking. With Boeing, it started with CEOs coming in and saying, we have to do more with less, right? Cost cutting. And then we have to do even more with even less stuff. So you build more airplanes with a smaller team. And then you build even more airplanes with an even smaller team. So they had, I guess, 42 77 MAX built at the beginning. Then they built 45, then they built 50, then 52, then 57 with ever smaller teams. You can do this only to a certain point without breaking the system, right? But if you push and you get more, and you push and you get more, then you think, well, then I can another one push more and push another one more. So you don't see the breaking point, and that's the danger. The best protection against all that is engage people in conversations, let them speak up, create a climate in which you can go to your manager and say, we cannot do more. It's impossible. Without fear. The fear is the biggest issue that has to disappear in these companies.
And I think there's a big difference whether we're talking about organizations or whether we're talking about society at large, or societies or nation societies, because they have different rules on how they work. So how emergence works in an organization is very different to how it works in a society. I think it's much easier to fix it in an organization, and that's already super complex. But fixing it at a societal level is a lot more difficult, I believe, because as said, emergence works very, very different and is much less influenceable unless you have a totalitarian or authoritarian state that you establish.
To which we
Yeah.
are
Guido, can I ask you, because when I was listening to you talk now, I started thinking about monoculture and immune systems in these organizations where you have so many similar people, becomes very much of a monoculture. So the immune system of the organization as an organism in itself becomes weaker. So
Yes.
you're more receptible to these diseases.
I totally agree. If you look at Volkswagen, they were bringing in only white old engineers to the top, and they were all morally problematic, and which is normal. We all want to be surrounded by people like us. We trust more other people when they are similar to us. So if I'm a psychopath like Piech, I of course pull up other psychopaths like Winterkorn, because I feel this is how management is done. This is the people I need. And at Boeing, you had 3 times in a row a CEO coming from the team of Jack Welch. It's the same thinking. There is no variety, no diversity of thinking. It's only these kind of people who come in and dominate. And if you look at the book, there are only 2 scandals where women play a role. Right? There's one manager at Wells Fargo, and there is Elizabeth Holmes at Theranos. All the rest is just men. So I agree. I think when there would be more diversity in boardrooms, for instance, there would be more perspectives, there would be more conversation, there would be maybe some warnings going on. But if everyone thinks alike, that these monocultures, they are dangerous. Yes.
But is the picture befitting paired that you chose? Because I think the immune system is not being weakened by the monoculture. It's being strengthened by the monoculture, because it's very easy to pick out every divergent object that enters the system. We had a conversation earlier that I'm still wondering how I could survive 20 years at GE by very professionally not fitting in at all. And they came after me several times, right? But I was kind of, German labor law is awesome, and labor lawyers are awesome too. That is something I find interesting, and what was resonating with me is the way we construct reality. Because it's not that we're receiving the world through what we see and what we hear, and then that gives us an impression of reality. It's what we have experienced in the past. So it works the other way around. And what has made us successful for a long, long time is something we know to be working. And then what our brain does is it creates a number of scenarios, and then it takes any signal it gets to pick the scenario to choose from. So the question I would have is, how do we change that when all the people that are retaining the power in the organizations have had experience that they are just propagating? So can we create a change without destroying it first?
What do you mean by destroying?
Well, classic Schumpeter approach. When we look at how societies developed, we usually push a reset button. And as I said earlier, when you read Hannah Arendt and others, and I'm German, it's 5 to 90-33 in the world as we see it today, which seems to be a very natural cycle that we're going through. So, can we take an off ramp, or are we taking the usual detour that we seem to be taking every 50 to 100 years as a society?
Well, for societies, probably it's a different thing than for organizations. But what you see in these organizations is that you can easily change these cultures by just bringing in a certain type of person. Boeing was merging with McDonnell Douglas, and McDonnell Douglas was coming with this GE culture. And they were taking over all the central positions at Boeing, and the old Boeing culture was quickly disappearing. I assume you can do this also the other way around. You bring in But after a scandal, normally you bring in a bunch of different people who think broader, more holistically, more ethically, and you change the culture in that direction. But what certainly will not work is that you have a male board and you bring in a woman, and that woman will probably behave more male than the man in the board. And that is what happened at Wells Fargo. You have this leader of the sales team, Miss Tolstead, and she behaved more rude than the man because she was the only woman. And if you want to survive as the only woman in a male context, you do what the others do, right? So that is not how diversity works, in my view. You need a certain mass. I mean, the German insurance company Allianz, they have 50% women in the board, and that makes already a huge difference when you discuss with them. It's a very different climate of interaction than in other companies.
But are we not risking, Guido, to conflate a number of things? One, your analysis is descriptive, right? So ultimately, it's a typology predicated on case studies. It's not a developmental model, so it's a heuristic, a diagnostic tool, perhaps, but its capacity to be universalized, I think, is somewhat limited. And secondly, I think there's a risk in reducing responsibility to some sort of thoughtlessness, right? So the fault is the context and the system, and I think Hannah Arendt would not agree to that, which I think, so in a nutshell, I think that there's a question as to what the underlying developmental model is, because that is not answered by simply a set of patterns. Secondly, there's a deeper question as to what morality means, because you're deploying a somewhat constructionist paradigm, which, I mean, being an Aristotelian, so to speak, I would strongly disagree with. And hence an intervention to say, stop the little rule breaking or bring in more women is questionable from a normative perspective, right? So it's not predicated on whatever a Rawlsian theory of justice or a Christian social teaching in terms of what a standard of goodness is. It seems to be predicated on, okay, here's a set of patterns that seem to deploy, and here's some sort of, I won't say random, but potentially mitigating circumstances against any of these patterns. You know what I mean? I think, I'm not sure we can draw such conclusions from this superb analysis. I love it, right? But I think there's some limitations on what's the underlying developmental model, and B, what is actually normatively good side, or am I misunderstanding you?
No. Yes, I guess you do, because that's why I said I analyzed this from two perspectives. One perspective is you are in a company and you want to avoid that this happens. And then you ask yourself, what can we do, right? That's one perspective. And then you come with diversity and different types of incentive systems. And so the other level of analysis to say, well, the system that we have designed is the monster, right? And we have to think about a different way of organizing the economy in our society. And that's where all these normative questions come in, and where you have to not talk about diversity in the boardroom or incentive systems, but you have to talk about shareholder value. You have to talk about different set of community creation. So these are two levels of analysis. I only want to avoid that managers and organizations think, well, if it's the system, then I can do nothing. I wait just until we have a different system, right? That's not, I don't want to get this signal. You can do something inside to avoid these horrible cultures, but that doesn't mean that we don't have to solve it on the system level, which is much more important than inside the organization. I guess we agree on that.
The problem,
we have to keep a congruence between kind of our role in this context versus what actions we might choose. I mean, some of us are in a position to influence who's on the board, and a lot of us are not in a position to influence who is on the board. So as a protagonist, then what's the context that I'm in, and what are the choices that are available to me? What are the responses that are available to me? Can I notice the things like ethical blindness and toxicity? I may not be able to change it at the cultural level from the position I'm in, but I can change it in the work group that I'm in.
We have always these three options: loyalty, voice, exit, always. So either we are staying and doing what we are told, and maybe changing a little bit here and there, protecting our team against a toxic superior, we speak up and try to change it, or we leave, right? But to leave is only possible, as we discuss in my group, is only possible if you think you have another option in life, you have a plan B, you can choose. Because most of the time when these people who break the rules and are part of these scandals are asked afterwards why they participated, they will say, I thought I had no choice. So they don't see the exit option. To the extreme point, like in the France Telecom story, that they even kill themselves, because that's for them the only exit option from the horrible situation. Having a choice is something very individual. You have to work on this. You have to think about alternatives. You have to do educations, improve your skills, and think, what would I do if I would not work in that company? But again, this is the level of trying to not become part of this thing. It's not, and Otti is right in that it's not about changing the system. To change the system, we need something very different. We need societal initiatives. It's not about how I act inside an organization, but inside the organization, I can choose not to be a toxic leader, and I can choose not to accept a toxic leader. It's always a choice.
But aren't you saying that it's someone else's job to change the society instead of our job to change the society?
No, I'm saying if you want to change society, you need to get organized with many others outside the organization. You cannot change society inside your organization. In your organization, which is bound to the system's rules, you can just try to avoid its worst consequences, but you cannot change it. I mean, even as a CEO, if you decide as a CEO not to maximize profit anymore, then you are no longer the CEO at one point. So your options are limited inside the organization, but you can be a change maker with others.
Yeah. So back to the matrix, cultivating awareness, creating allies, creating
Yes.
pressure, those types of things.
And the allies is important, because what I see in these organizations happening all the time is when someone speaks up, they do this alone. They do not try to find support. And if I do this alone and it's a risky situation, the others will just stay silent. It's the bystander effect. They will not help me. But if I organize the resistance, or if I organize the speaking up with others before I do it, it can be much more powerful. And I'm protected to a certain degree.
If they then stand up with you, because you might
Yes,
always
always the
have
risk that they don't. But at least you increase the chances of not being alone if you prepare the others, if you try to create a coalition. I mean, if you look at the France Telecom scandal where people killed themselves under the pressure, the most sad thing that I found in all these stories is the fact that the colleagues, when someone breaks down in the office, crying under all that pressure, just take their laptops and go to another office. They do not even speak with the person anymore, because speaking with the victim of the bully, we know this from schools already. Taking the side of the victim of the bully means that you probably are the next victim of the bully. So it's better to take the side of the bully and let the victims alone. That's why allyship is so important, and this point in Tom's matrix for me is so key.
Question. I haven't read the book yet because I haven't driven down to Locarno yet to
That's
pick
a
it
shame.
up. But do you have a case in there with a culture that is more East? I don't like, polarities, but with the more Eastern culture, like a company that's rooted somewhere in China, Japan, India,
we have cases from China, we have cases from Europe, we have cases from the USA, we have cases from the Nordics, Germany. So very different cultural contexts, and it's always the same, because these pressure contexts, they're always stronger than national cultures. They beat national culture. Fear beats every national culture. And it happens anywhere. So yes, in the Nordics, speaking up is easier than in China, but if you have psychopath leadership in a Nordic organization like the Karolinska Hospital that we investigate, it's the same effect. People are silent, they're scared, they don't speak up. So it's not culturally bound. It's just happening potentially everywhere.
Is a toxic culture eventually doomed to decay and self-destruct, or will it just thrive as long as possible, kind of like in a survival mode? Thank you.
In a company that is highly toxic, you can be very innovative. Take Elon Musk's companies, super toxic. You can Google that. They're all toxic. Climate of fear, harassment, it's all there. But they're innovative until now. I think what the problem is that if something happens outside that somehow blocks you in your innovation, that somehow creates an obstacle and you are stuck, then the toxic culture is inferior to any other culture. But as long as you are riding the wave of success, you can be very successful and be very toxic, sadly. That's what I tend to believe now.
Yeah, but be careful. I mean, I can be very creative and create the next nuclear bomb. I mean, creativity is not necessarily an indication of morality.
Yeah. I was going to ask you, because in the Prometheus thinking, right or wrong, the balance, the control was the human factor. Is you can be very successful creating things. You can be very successful financially, but what is the human or consequence of what you're doing? And I sometimes, Adi, wonder if this is what you are going for with your goodness piece, because if you don't have democracy, the people who are affected by your organization or your society have no opportunity to change it.
Well, I jump in for a second just because I see that playing out in all sorts of different philosophies, whether it's Martin Buber or Arbinger. It's and one of my professors wrote a paper on the transformational leadership and the fundamental option for self-transcendence. So what do we hold in view? He looked at the literature on transformational leadership and said, if you made a list, you can see Gandhi's a transformational leader, but Hitler qualifies too. So there's a moral element, and that it was about, is it justifying and reinforcing a self-embedded ego, or is it trying to transcend the self to something greater, which has this implicit kind of goodness or moral tone to it?
Maybe you need an authoritarian chief operating officer, but you need a humanitarian.
And is it a benevolent
a democratic
authoritarian
board?
I second that, the CEO part. No,
I'm
but
always a bit-
I wanted to. Can I say one thing on the transformation leadership? I mean, I don't like these style theories, but I think you're pointing to something important where, let's be clear, democracy for Aristotle was the corrupted form of politeia, right? So the idea that democracy is intrinsically good, you have to be American pragmatist to believe that, right? I think most of the forefathers of liberal politics and democracy were very skeptical towards the tyranny of the majority and similar phenomena. And so democracy is not intrinsically good. So I think again, there's a little bit of a risk here to conflating governance forms, which in Plato's Republic, democracy was at the bottom, with goodness, right? So if we make the judgment that choice and freedom is good, then we might come to the conclusion that certain forms, be it Rawlsian kind of social contract theory, etc., are superior. But that is already a choice. Right? So again, to the question as to are there some Eastern cases involved? If we're in Japan or in China, then goodness wouldn't be the same as my maximum freedom to the extent that I'm not infringing someone else's freedom. That wouldn't be the definition of justice in that system.
Well, as long as Asian companies apply neoliberal thinking, they're like us.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter whether they're Chinese or Japanese or American or European. They're like us. It's the same system. You squeeze
Exactly.
people to produce more, you give them unachievable goals, you have toxic leaders. It's just the same.
I agree.
And the result is the same.
It'd be great, Guido, to look at this. Was it Tanaka? Is that the name of the steering wheel airbag company that let so many faulty products out into the market forever and falsified their data? That's a Japanese company.
Yeah. Yeah, you
So
have
it's-
these cases everywhere. And not just companies. You have them in NGOs, you have them in hospitals, you have them in trans-humanitarian organizations, because the overarching ideological system is the same for all organizations. It's about growth, it's about strong leaders, it's about incentives and goal setting and language. It's regardless of what the organization is doing.
So it's
But the
this
comparatives
also,
would be different, Guido. I think there's so let's say the Chinese, if they look at the company, would say you're not Confucian enough, right? So you should show your duties to the society. If we were in Africa, they would probably look at Ubuntu and say, okay, you need to care for the collective. If we are in the church, they would say you should do contemplation. It's not about people having voice, but spiritual leadership. So we're taking decisions in silence, thinking about Christ, etc. So the comparator would be different. So saying the solution is people should have voice and speak up actively, that seems to be more a Western democratic ideal.
I'm not so sure, because you also need people speaking up in the other context to drive alternative ideas about what to do, right? Someone has to say it. And then there have to be discussions about that. And I think
why do you say that that's a democratic ideal? Speaking up, that's knowledge creation. That's has nothing to do with democracy. That's
speaking
apples and
up.
oranges.
No, but the right to speak up and the right to be heard, that is a key element of democracy. And that's what we do in Switzerland. We do referendums when we.
Yeah, but it's not limited only to democracy. It's part of the democratic idea because it has value.
No, it has value because it's part of the democratic idea.
Yeah, I don't think so. But so it doesn't exist outside of democratic models. You don't think Elon Musk has conversations and people don't speak up in his mind?
Yes, but if they disagree, he fires them and he humiliates them on Twitter. We have seen that.
Yeah.
And that's not democracy. I mean, anyway, in corporations, there is no democracy.
Yeah, well, we're jumping between corporations and society and politics.
I think there are probably different ways different cultures do speaking up. Some are much more direct, some are much more indirect, but I think there's some form of some sort of speaking up or coming to consensus or something that is probably ultimately generally desirable.
Yeah.
You had mentioned a few minutes ago that one of the key ways in which organizations go wrong is when somebody starts breaking rules. And then if that is tolerated, then other rules get to be violated, and maybe more important ones than the no smoking in the office rule. But sometimes there are bad rules, and it depends on whether, and rules is applies to broadly, but if the rule is make the sales quota or the production quota, or if the rule is do it whatever it takes, or the boss just says do this thing and you either have to violate what you know is a securities guideline rule, or you break the rule of what your boss just said. What's the metric that you can use to determine which rules need to be followed and which rules ought to be violated? Because I don't think a blind adherence to rules is a good heuristic.
Right.
I think the kind of rules that a company should not make available to people as being optional is legal rules. Simply like that. If a company disagrees with some legal rules, they should lobby for some other rules, but it should not be in their hands to break those rules. Because if that would be the case, then rules wouldn't make sense anymore. Everyone would just apply the laws they want to apply. So that's one thing. Then the other thing is moral rules. If you violate rules that people perceive as morally necessary, for instance, treat each other with respect. Do not sell your customers something they don't need just because you want to fill your quota. These kind of rules are moral rules. They're not legally bound, but they are moral rules, and we probably agree on them, and they should not be broken either for the sake of profit. If we break a moral rule, it should be a rule that is broken in a dilemma in order to defend another moral rule, right? But that is the result of a deliberation, of a discussion, of something that then applies to the whole company. It's not interpreted by individuals secretly. So I break this rule because I got the signal from my boss. I can break rules as long as I sell. That is the thing we should avoid. And I don't claim there's a clear line between them. No, of course not. It's difficult, but that again requires deliberation. It requires discussion, moral conversations, which normally don't happen in a company.
Can I jump in with a question? Because I was just thinking of Spicer and Alveson and the systemic stupidity. Is your work close to that, you think?
I have worked a lot with the work that Alveson and Wilmot have done previously on critical management, but I haven't looked into that in more detail. So I don't know.
Well, good. Just a couple more room for a couple more questions. Anybody? There's a couple people who have been observing and thinking silently, and
I mean, I'm interested in sort of, if I can introduce one quick thing. I do have to leave at the top of the hour. Unfortunately, I can't stay longer than
so
that.
do the rest of us.
We were talking, we didn't get to finish in our group about increasing choice, or like increasing the ability for people to question and have these conversations and not fall into the rut of these dark patterns, not just on an individual level, but on a societal level. What norms, rules, guidelines, laws, regulations, like I'm open to any level of societal intervention, but what can we do to not make the incentives there, or where a rational, uncaring actor will fall into dark patterns often? How do we change the incentive structures at a societal level so that that's not what happens so often? It's not nearly as pervasive as it is today.
We probably have to teach people to cooperate better, to work together. There's this beautiful initiative that was initiated by a political scientist, Fishkin is his name. He created citizen assemblies, which means he randomly chooses citizens in places where they discuss about a topic like climate change in my village. What can we do about this? They get briefed by experts, and then they develop ideas and solutions. And what this kind of exercise showed, and he tried this in many contexts for many topics, is not only come these people up with good ideas when they get briefed, and they are taxi drivers and professors, they're everything. They also become more coherent as a group. They become better citizens. So they learn to be citizens. And this is something where we can go back to John Dewey, because he always said democracy is not just a place where you vote and you participate. Democracy is a school of life. You learn to be a citizen by engaging with others in democracy and thereby making it stronger. So I think we need more of these bottom-up initiatives where we involve citizens in making decisions on their communities, small communities, big communities, because this feeling of powerlessness against all these huge problems we face, war and fascism and climate crisis, that is so overwhelming that people say, okay, maybe I need just this strong leader who makes me these promises. No, you can be part of the solution bottom up, and you can make a difference. And that is what we need to teach them, I guess. But it's a long way, of course. It takes time.
And isn't that
Thank
where
you.
it needs to start? Like the conversation has been on what I would call the wrong recursion level, on organizations, society, and above and beyond that. Doesn't the recursion have to go a level down to the individual? So unless you see yourself and unless you have that conviction and you understand your own mistakes, like not looking at systems, not looking at rules, not looking at guidelines, but unless you figure out who you want to be and what you're doing, this is all going to be very difficult. I mean, Oti, I would love to hear your perspective because you're always edgy on that stuff, and I'm not quite sure what you're trying to achieve. I know Nikki would probably agree from how I know her, and yeah, and it wasn't my thought. It was a thought that was in the room here, maybe, but I needed to push it into the room there because I wanted to hear and see a response to that.
But but I mean, I'm not with Guido on this one. I think Guido and I will hopefully at one point meet over a good glass of beer and have a conversation about democracy and Dewey. But yeah, I'm not as convinced that the answer is individual. I think I'm with Guido on the importance of context. I would even say institutions. In my experience, a lot of the individual behaviors are driven by institutional context, not by individual consciousness or awareness. I think Karl Marx said very clearly that most of what we think individual consciousness is societal consciousness, right? And if you look at Bourdieu or Giddens or any of the sociologists, you will see that, right? Hence, yes, discussion, but Donald Trump, and Guido, this is where I was going, Donald Trump still had 46% of people supporting him at the time when he came in with all the tariffs, right? So it didn't seem that people just kind of participating in elections by itself were making things better. So I think Switzerland is a good practice. So you have the conversation, you have deliberation, you bring people together with information, and you practice citizenry in a different way. So it's not enough to just allow people to participate and just have a voice. I wanted to ask, if I may, Guido, one question, that because you mentioned Hannah Arendt a few times, right? Was there not in any of the cases that you looked at a point at which you said evil does exist? It's not just constructed in context. There's something which is really evil in all of this, which impressed even you, so to speak.
Well, in any case, evil exists, right? You always have a psychopath at the top who is a bad person. But the scandal cannot be explained by the person at the top, because it's not Winterkorn who creates that software. It's not the CEO of Wells Fargo who cheats on customers. It's the people in the middle who do it, right? The evil person is just the context creator. So in that sense, they are part of the context. They don't break the law themselves. No one of those people went to prison except for Elizabeth Holmes, the only woman in the stories. Everyone else gets away with a big bonus out of these stories. And there are evil people. But then again, you can ask, why are they evil? Are they evil by nature, or because they learned in that system that this is how you succeed? And did Winterkorn not learn from Piech of how to be a rough leader? So is he a clinical psychopath or a behavioral psychopath? And is a behavioral psychopath evil as well? Or is it the system making that the case? So it's not so easy to answer. But I think we agree. I'm not claiming it's individuals bottom up who are the solution. It's society that designs institutions in a way that individuals bottom up can make a change happen. That is what we do in Switzerland, and that is important. And that is not what happened in the US. We just vote after you watched Foxconn for your whole life, right?
One last comment, Guido, because we're out of time, other than thank you very much for coming.
No more comment. Just thank you for being here and for the discussion. I enjoyed it.
Okay, everyone, go out there and wait for society to change it for us, or do something to change society. Go for it. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you all.